Greetings, friends, and welcome to the podcast of Jewish Ideas, a Torah in Motion podcast. I'm JJ Kimchi. The concept of Tzimtzum, which is often translated as divine contraction or self-limitation, is one that is well known to those familiar with the history of Kabbalah, especially with the writings of Rabbi Isaac Luria or the Arizal. Yet what is much less well known is that the concept of Tzimtzum has a long and complex history throughout the modern period, with various versions of it appearing in the writings of Christian Kabbalists, early modern scientists, Hasidic masters, Maskilic intellectuals, German Romantic philosophers, and 20th century theorists. Today we shall be taking a tour through the landscape of Tzimtzum, discovering the rich philosophical legacy of this intriguing concept. Guiding us through this landscape today is Dr. Christoph Schulte, Professor of Philosophy and Judaism, as well as the Chairman of the Department of Jewish and Religious Studies at Potsdam University in Germany. He has written widely on elements of modern Judaism, and his latest book by the University of Pennsylvania Press is called Tzimtzum, God and the Origin of the World, which is, of course, the subject of our discussion today. I've just finished this book and can highly recommend it to our readers, and it's a pleasure to welcome Professor Schulte to the podcast of Jewish Ideas today. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you for having me.
Excellent. So let's jump in. And Tzimtzum obviously is an important concept, has a lengthy history, which we can explore. But first, let's try and come up with some sort of definition. What, if you had to answer on one leg, what does the word Tzimtzum mean? Can we arrive at such a definition?
Tzimtzum is a Hebrew noun, and it says contraction, actually. And in the Kabbalistic tradition, it is translated as the self-contraction of God before he created the world.
Right. And so as you say, Tzimtzum is a concept that, so far as we can tell, I think, first comes up in Kabbalistic writing, specifically in the writings of Isaac Luria, who was an important 16th century Kabbalist writing in Tzfat, otherwise known as the Arizal. So could you perhaps give us a little bit of a background on what Tzimtzum means within his context, how he used it, and how exactly he introduced this concept into the world?
Actually, we do not have a text of Isaac Luria on the Tzimtzum. We have the description of the Tzimtzum by some of his disciples. But let me put this into context first. Rav Isaac Luria formed a group of disciples in Tzfat, in the northern Galilee, north of the Kinneret, around the year 1570, and he died prematurely in 1572. So actually, we know that he has been teaching to a group of disciples, 30 disciples that were divided into 4 chavurot, comradeships. So about 30 disciples who heard his teachings orally, his oral teachings almost every day. And so he has been teaching Kabbalah in Tzfat for about 2 years. And these teachings were esoteric. He kind of had sessions with his disciples or a group of his disciples and told him about the inner life of the divine, of the Ein Sof, the limitless being of God, even before the creation of the world. 4 of these disciples report about these lessons and about his teaching, Luria's teachings of the Tzimtzum. So what we have actually is not an original text of Luria where we can say, okay, this is our authentic source and we know what exactly what Luria told us. No, what we have is 4 disciples who wrote about the teachings of Rav Luria, and in these writings we find descriptions, a narrative of the Zimzum. Among these 4 disciples stands out Rav Chaim Vital, and he wrote down a very lengthy description of the Zimtzum. And this is the source where most of the following interpretations of the Zimtzum pick this text and refer to this text and follow the description in that text.
Right. So how is let's say the writings of Chaim Vital describes this concept of Tzimtzum. So in this, let's say original, we can only use original in this kind of not entirely authentic sense, because of course he's reporting secondhand. But let's say this original text. So Zimtzum, what is it? Why is it necessary? Is it a spatial thing? In other words, God had to contract himself because there wasn't space for anything else. Is this seen as a more of a psychological thing or a metaphysical thing? How exactly is this concept of Zimtzum birthed into the world?
Firstly, we do not know if it was really a concept, but it is described as the concept. For we have no original text in our hands. We can only refer to what Chaim Vital or Moshe Yonah or Israel Saruk and these disciples who write about Zimtzum, what they understood and how they understood what he told. So what we have is interpretations of a narrative that we do not know in the original. So they all refer to the teachings of Ha'ari, Rav Yitzchak Luria Hagadol, and this is what we have, and this is what we can interpret. So, and in these narratives, among all the narrative of Chaim Vital, he describes how the Ein Sof, and that is the Kabbalistic notion of the infinite divine being, which filled all the space, which with everything, because the infinite, before the creation of the world, was filled all space, filled everything, and it had, as the term Ein Sof says, the infinite has no temporal or spatial limits. So God kind of was everywhere, in every time. And what kind of attracts most of the people who hear about Zimtzum is this concept that the divine Ein Sof sets itself some limits. The divine Ein Sof contracts, and that is what Chaim Vital describes in his work Etz Chaim. The divine Ein Sof withdraws from a void within itself, and it creates a void, a circular, hollow void within itself that is free of Ein Sof. So the divine Ein Sof surrounds this empty, hollow void in the midst of the Ein Sof. And why can we say in the midst? Because the void is there in an unlimited being. The midst is where it contracts. So the creation of this void by contraction, by the self-contraction of the divine. And that is a self-contraction of the divine light of the Ein Sof. It is a self-contraction of the divine perfection. It is a self-contraction of the divine power. So we have the phenomenon that the Zimtzum, the Zimtzum, the self-withdrawal of God of the Ein Sof from this void creates a space and is described as the creation of a space inside the divine Ein Sof, and inside the divine, a space that gives room for the creation of our world into this void. and into this hollow space. So that we have the notion or the narrative of the creation of our universe in the midst of the divine and in the midst of the Ein Sof, and that is seems to be a very fascinating idea. This withdrawal of the Ein Sof, of the divine Ein Sof, creates something and gives freedom to something, creates something different from the Ein Sof, which before the Zimtzum, this Ein Sof was an amorphous, non-differentiated, non-directed divine being, and that had no other, that had no difference, that knew no difference. And now we have, by the Zimtzum, we have a different space, and another to this all-encompassing and almighty divine being.
So this is a fascinating concept, because the implication of it is left, if it wasn't limited, left unchecked, the divine presence would simply overwhelm everything else. There couldn't be anything else in existence if there wasn't a conscious self-limitation on the part of God. And it's also a very, I don't know if you agree, sort of a daring theological point, that it is possible for God to limit themselves, because that would seem to place a limit on God, but presumably only God could do that, as it were.
Yeah, and it's kind of so the Zimtzum is not only a self-limitation and a withdrawal, and these are the major translations of Zimtzum, of the Hebrew substantive Zimtzum, is self-withdrawal, self-contraction, self-limitation, also, and it's also not also a limitation of space and time. It's also a self-limitation of the divine power. And that is very, very interesting, that we have there a concept of creation that is not only of creation, but also a concept of creativity that is very attractive, because we have created a model of creation and creativity that is not overwhelming everything, that does not, create by action, aggressiveness, aggression, orientation, but by withdrawal, that gives space to something that is different. So that makes a different life possible. That is kind of a dialogical model of creation, so that the creation is not progress and power and overwhelming, but creation is that something grows by withdrawal. Something different grows by withdrawal, and that's a very fascinating concept, above all for artists. But that is far later than the reception of the Zimtzum by artists happens much later than the 16th century.
Excellent. So in which case, let's dive into it, because of course your book is largely about the 400 or so years of extraordinary reception of this idea. So I mean, one of the first things it does is it gets picked up by various Christian Kabbalists in the 17th century. And so my question is, and I think I'm going to ask this several times over the next minutes, is how did they see this? Why did they take this on as an important idea, and how did they sort of shape it in their own image, the idea of Zimtzum?
Well, what the book describes is actually the process of transformation and tradition that picks up this Kabbalistic notion, told a narrative that is told to a small circle of esoteric disciples, that is written down, and then it by way of writing down it, we have manuscripts that are kind of handed over to other Kabbalists, but it's still very esoteric. It was forbidden. Luria did not want it to be fixed graphically. and then the disciples told only to other Kabbalists. So it was a very esoteric way of handing the message of Zimzum over to other Kabbalists and so on. But then already 30 years, 40 years, in 1612, the first book on Zimzum appeared in print by a Kabbalist in Prague. And this print, once the Zimzum, the esoteric teaching of Zimzum is printed, you can buy the book, and it becomes exoteric, because Christians can buy the book, non-Kabbalists can buy the book, and this is how the concept of Zimzum became popular. And then in the 17th century, the Christian Kabbalist Christian Knorr von Rosenroth from Sulzbach in Bavaria wrote collected manuscripts and prints of the Zimzum and translated them into Latin and paraphrased the narrative of Zimzum into Latin. And once it was translated into Latin, which was the scholarly language of all scholars, Jewish and non-Jewish, at the time, it was an exoteric philosophical concept that became popular among the scholars in Central Europe and also in England. And that's how how the Zimzum concept became known to Newton and to Henry Moore and to the so-called Cambridge Platonists. But it became known also among Christian theologians who were very interested in the concept. By the way, Protestant theologians in Germany anyway knew Hebrew, would also have access to the original text, and would read even the Zimzum, not only the translations of Knorr von Rosenroth, but also the Hebrew manuscripts and prints. And so it became known as among philosophers in Central Europe and in Western Europe, but also among theologians, even simple pastors and parish pastors in Germany, pietists, and so on. It became the concept of Zimzum was known among Christian scholars first, but then and it made its way also in Jewish circles, where it became in the 17th century also well known and spread by print from Palestine, where the concept originated in Tzfat. It became known in Italy, and from Italy it went to Amsterdam, to the Hebrew book printers in Amsterdam, in Livorno, and above all in Eastern Europe, in Krakow, and then in Galicia.
So let's attack the first of these groups, because you mentioned, and it's an amazing thing, because it's unusual that you have a Kabbalistic concept began as an esoteric concept among a small circle of initiates that spread all over Europe, as you say, to Christian theologians, to Jewish Kabbalists, to scientists, to Platonists, and intellectual circles all over the civilized world as it was then at the time. And so, let's attack the first of these groups. Why would Christian theologians be interested in this? What were they doing with Zimzum? Why did they see this and say, this is something worthy of our consideration?
In the 17th century, you had kind of a change in the picture of our universe, because we had the Copernican revolution, and we had Galileo Galilei, who was influential, and they changed our picture of the universe. And Zimzum is all about creation, and so you had a Copernican turn in the sciences, in astronomy, in physics. So all these Christian scholars and also their Jewish disciples, we have Jews sitting in the lectures of Galileo Galilei. So that was known, and the Christians, as well as those young Jewish, the first generation of Jewish scholars who did university studies, sitting in the lectures of Galileo Galilei and so on, and you had an interest on cosmology. How did this world come into being with the sun and the planetary systems, and how did this all originate? How came this into being? How can you kind of make compatible this new ideas about the planetary system and the new cosmology with the religious thought about creation? And that Zimzum is a key concept, because it offers a solution to the concept of the creation out of nothingness. How can God, the Almighty God, create a universe that is different from God and still be present in this system? How can that happen? And does this Kabbalistic concept of Zimzum offer a solution or an idea of how this could happen? And this was fascinating for Jewish as well as Christian scholars and philosophers. You have the speculations about the origin of our cosmos. You have this speculation in Jewish writings, in Christian writings, and that was a kind of a early modern scholarly problem that was solved by this concept of Zimzum, because you could all of a sudden, and Henry Moore and Newton are all about how did this space come into being, and so Zimzum offered a definition, a narrative, an idea of how inside of God can be created our cosmos, namely by the withdrawal of God, who gives place to our cosmology.
That's fascinating. I'm wondering, I mean, does it also help possibly, and especially in this era, with a bit of a, let's say, a more philosophical problem, namely that of human agency, or of agency of creatures outside of God, meaning that God limiting not only his physical space, his presence, that which he takes up, but also limiting his own power, limiting his own, its own direct influence in running things, and allowing space for the action of others. Does this come into this at this stage yet, or not?
No, from the very start, even among the early disciples of Loya, they already discussed the problem of how, not only how the creation of the world can happen, also how can something like the free will of human being come. So we have already in Maimonides, in the medieval Jewish philosophy, we have the problem that if God determines everything, man has no free will, and man is not responsible for his sins and so on. So Zimzum gives us an idea that God creates a void, and in that void, the free human will, which is not determined by the will of the Almighty, God comes into being. In that, you need a void free of the will of God to have the free will of man. And so the notion of Zimzum does not only solve a cosmological problem, it also solves an ethical problem, namely, how can the free will of man be possible in a universe that is determined by God's will? And you need this idea of Zimzum in order to explain why man has a free will.
Right. Fascinating. It's interesting, especially because, at least to the popular imagination, let's say, one doesn't immediately associate Kabbalah, and specifically Lurianic Kabbalah, with deep engagement with philosophical concepts. But here you have a key concept like Tzimtzum, which not only has, as you say, cosmological and theological implications, but also philosophical implications. It allows the solving of a philosophical conundrum which, plagued thinkers from all religious traditions for centuries.
Yeah, and the problem of free will is, of course, in among Jews, among Christians, among Muslims, is really a theological key problem, and because it is necessary to have this idea of the free will if you want to stand by the idea of human responsibility for his actions. Because he has a free will, he is responsible for what he does or what he does not. So the whole idea of sin is based on that. And the whole idea of good action is also the idea of that man can obey the divine mitzvot or disobey the divine mitzvot. That presupposes the idea of a free will. And so there can be no free will if God does not limit his will and his determination, his all-powerful influence on this world. And by the Zimtzum, we have the idea that God not only limits his presence in the world, he also limits his will.
Fascinating. We could talk so much more about this, but I want to get back into the chronological timeline. There's so much more to cover. So let's turn a little bit to some of the major Jewish developments in the early modern period, namely the Shabtai Tzvi, as a movement, messianic movement, in the mid 1600s, and then almost a century later, the movement that became known as the Hasidic movement, starting with the Baal Shem Tov and the early Hasidic masters. And of course, famously, Gershom Scholem, the great theorist of Kabbalah and scholar of the subject, he drew a very strong connection between them. That actually, Kabbalah came directly on the heels of Shabtai Tzvi, of Sabbatianism. And so I wanted to ask about the concept of Zimtzum in these two movements. How, in the Sabbatian generation, was Zimtzum understood, conceptualized, and how this carried, and how it was also conceptualized by the early Kabbalistic by the early Hasidic masters. And is there a connection between the two? Can we draw a conceptual line between these two, or not really?
In Lurianic Kabbalah, the idea of Tzimtzum is closely connected to two other concepts, namely the concept of the breaking of the vessels, Shvirat HaKelim, and the Tikkun, to repair the world. That makes the Tzimtzum is in a close connections to the idea of the Tikkun, of the repair and the, what would you say, the redemption of the world. The idea of Luria and his disciples is that every Jew can, by his action, by obeying the mitzvot, can contribute to the healing, to the repair of this world. And that makes the idea, the tikkun, or the cooperation of man in healing and kind of repairing this world and redeeming this world, makes it makes the whole Luranic Kabbalah very interesting for all movements of piety in Judaism. That is Sabbatianism, which is a piety movement where you have even a Messiah, or others would say a pseudo Messiah, where the followers of the Messiah can contribute to the redemption of the world. And in Hasidism, again, you have a movement, a pious movement of pious persons who adapt this Lurianic Kabbalah because it offers to simple followers and to simple men the possibility to contribute to the redemption of a fallen world. And this makes the Lurianic Kabbalah very interesting and attractive for piety movements in Judaism. And this is how Zimzum is a part of the whole parcel of the Lurianic Kabbalah, comes into those piety movements and is interesting for them. They are not mainly interested, in teachings, speculative teachings about the origin of the cosmos and so on, but they are attracted by this move that you can, as an individual, as a pious individual, can take part in the redemption of the world. That is fascinating, and that's how the notion of Zimzum in the package with the Lurianic Kabbalah was very interesting and very important for the Sabbatian movement and also for Hasidism in the 17th and then later in the 18th century.
Interesting. So I suppose that would be the golden thread, not so much Zimzum itself, but the whole package of Zimzum and Shvira and Tikkun and essentially, yes. And if one defines these movements as a movement towards piety or towards redeeming or fixing the world in some sense, so then that is a very attractive way of going about it. Interesting. So if we could, I'd like to possibly drill down to some very specific early, because there were some early Hasidic masters that were, I would say, theorists, as well as practical leaders of pietistic movements. Famously, the Baal Shem Tov was much more the latter. But there were some Hasidic masters. So, for example, Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, for instance, and a few others. Were there advances in the theory of Tzimtzum as well in the Kabbalist, in the early Hasidic period? Were there, did they come up with new layers or new theories of the concept itself?
They are follow in a line of always new interpretations. They are not copying everything. They are, each interpretation is a renewal of the message, and we find among the Hasidim in the Hasidic movement, we find major figures who adopted and adapted the idea of the Tzimtzum and added new, I would say, spheres of meaning, new ideas about what else can be said about the Tzimtzum. And for example, Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the founder of the Chabad movement, had in his Tanya, in his major book, has a very clear new idea about the Tzimtzum. Namely, he interprets the Tzimtzum not only as the withdrawal of the divine light, which was the early modern idea. The Tzimtzum Ein Sof, the Or Ein Sof, the divine light, withdraws from, and then God puts light into the hollow, dark void. And he adds, not only does God, send his light, his creative light by creation of the world. The world is created by divine light. The Shneur Zalman of Liadi adds that not only divine light, but also divine vitality is infused into our world. So God, in this act of Tzimtzum, infuses light and creates our cosmos and our universe by light and by chiyut, by his vitality. That is new, but it is very close to ideas that come up in the sciences in the end of the 18th century. That we had the progress in physics, and chemistry the scholars become interested in chemistry, and we have there must be something else than light. And so they have this idea that there is kind of a divine vitality that is infused into our universe. And that makes sense in the light of the progress in the sciences in the end of the 18th century.
Fascinating. Okay, once again, there's so much more, and I recommend also to sort of delve into this in the book itself. But I want to move on to sort of the other side of the coin of what was going on in the late 18th and early 19th century in Europe, which was namely, or in Jewish Europe, namely the advent of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment. And various thinkers within those orbits, because many of them rejected Kabbalah. Many of them saw Kabbalah either as something incidental or a sort of an element of Jewish thought or Jewish intellectual activity, which very much was not at the center of what Judaism is. They favored the rationalistic aspects or elements of Jewish thought. That was some of them. And others, especially in the early 19th century, dismissed Kabbalah altogether and really thought it was pernicious and sort of an element that needs to be excised and thrown out of Judaism. And yet, the concept of Zimzum is still present in some of these authors. So to the extent that the Maskilic thinkers, at least some of them, addressed Zimzum, what were they saying about it, and how do they incorporate it into a worldview that stressed Jewish enlightenment?
We have, and that is very interesting. Since the Haskalah, we have kind of a East-Western divide in European Jewry. We have in Eastern Europe a growing Hasidic movement that lasts all through the 19th century up until the 20th century, until the Shoah is the dominant religious group in Eastern Europe. And there you have Zimzum in many Hasidic writings and many Hasidic schools, and everybody knows about Zimzum. You have Isaac Bashevis singers still knowing Zimzum from the Lurianic sources, son of a pious Jew. So in Eastern Europe, you have a tradition that picks up Lurianic thought until the 21st century. Among Hasidic circles until today, in the Chabad movement, you have the presence of the idea of Tzimtzum everybody knows about. Whereas in Western Europe, in Central and Western Europe, you have the Haskalah, and you have the fight of the Maskilim against Hasidism, against Kabbalah, and the first Maskilim still knew about the Zimzum because they came from circles like Shlomo Maimon, knew about it and describes the Zimzum and describes a lot of Kabbalistic ideas, but then criticizes it and says it's all nonsense. And then the Western Jews turn away from Hasidut. They turn away from Kabbalah and turn to Western science and so on. And they also ignore, for example, that Newton had a good knowledge of Kabbalah. So the only Newton they know is the Principia Mathematica and the scholarly writings, not what the metaphysical speculations.
Ironically enough,
in Western Jewry, you have the turn away from Kabbalah and Hasidut, and so the idea of Zimzum in the 19th century is almost forgotten.
Right.
You have some specialists in Wissenschaft des Judentums, in Jewish studies, who of course know all the stuff, and so, but for them it's like Heinrich Grätz. They would say, okay, yes, they have this strange idea of Zimzum, but it's all nonsense. It's all, those guys still believe in miracles, and for them that was not the way you can be a bourgeois, emancipated, enlightened Jew. So they refused not only Kabbalah, but also these special, in particular, these special speculations about the breaking of the vessels and Zimzum. That was for them, old-fashioned stuff, but you better forget about it.
But it's interesting to me, but as you said, there were one or two, for example, Shlomo Maimon, a great Jewish thinker at the end of the 18th century and a close associate of Mendelssohn and Kant, who was using this concept. I mean, it wasn't completely forgotten from those circles. So what role did it play there? You're right, it is a great curiosity that it was dismissed and forgotten and sort of thrown away to a large degree by intellectuals on the central and western side of Europe. But it's curious that a small amount of it remains, and I'm interested in sort of touching on that.
Yes, they have this knowledge, but they have also kind of an inner resistance. It's you don't accept just what your father tells you. And on all these generations, and he Shlomo Maimon in his autobiography would describe this Eastern Jewish world in like a very strange where you have miracle doing rabbis and who still believe they can without going to a medical doctor, you put an amulet and you can heal a person by amulet instead of medicine. And for him, that was just an unacceptable idea. So he put away his great knowledge of Kabbalah and he can refer to it, but he mocks. He also kind of mocks about this old stuff. And for them, that's not the way Jews in the future should take. For them, it was enlightenment, it was science, it was for many of the Maskilim who knew about those old concepts, but that was not the way you could be an emancipated a Jew in the 19th century, in a bourgeois society, and where you're a citizen in a modern state, in a modern national state, and so on. So you have no Zimzum in France, in England, in Germany. The Jews there want to be emancipated citizens with equal rights in their countries, and for them that was all old-fashioned, better forgotten stuff. And it is very interesting that around 1800, Shlomo Maimon died in 1800. The knowledge of Zimzum was more widespread among Christian philosophers than in the writings of Jewish philosophers.
Right, we'll get there one moment. Sorry, I'm just trying to go, piece by piece. This is an extraordinary puzzle of intellectual history. But it is interesting to me because, as you mentioned earlier, so sort of among the Haskalah and I would say late Maskilim, including the members of the Wissenschaft, the student movement, so Heinrich Gretz and other prominent historians of Judaism in the 19th century in the Germanic states. What's interesting is that, as you say, from a theoretical perspective of their own philosophy of Judaism and religion, Tzimtzum is pushed out, right? However, this is also the rise of the science of Judaism, of the historical study of Judaism. So it's ironic that it is exactly at this point that the study of Kabbalah is in ascent, essentially. That more and more of these scholars are taking a look at Kabbalah and are providing, people like Heinrich Gretz or Moritz Steinschneider or Adolf Jelinek. They are providing the first real academic treatises on Kabbalah and describing it and sort of doing the investigations of it, even as they are rejecting it for the first time. It's sort of odd imbalance that sees a dip in personal philosophy, but a rise in academic interest, even if they are personally hostile to it.
Yeah, I mean, those founders of Wissenschaft des Judentums, like Zunz, or you named the Steinschneider or Geiger, they knew about Zimzum and they knew about Urianic Kabbalah, but they have a clear preference because they want to be equal citizens in a modern nation state, and they have a clear preference for the rationalist traditions in Judaism. So in medieval philosophy, they would tell you everything about Maimonides and Yosef Albo and Yehuda Halevi and so on, the rationalist tradition, and they would kind of disadvantage Kabbalah, which is also a medieval phenomenon. And this, but to them it seemed too speculative, too pious, too irrational. So it was kind of suppressed. The knowledge, I mean, they had a vast knowledge and they knew about it, but the preference was the rationalistic traditions in Judaism. And that means also that they preferred in religion, and they were all liberal or conservative Jews, they preferred a reform of Judaism. They went against orthodoxy and ultra-orthodoxy, what we would today call orthodoxy and ultra-orthodoxy, and they disagreed. So even in the religious traditions, they rather had a preference for rationalistic philosophers and for halakha, and not for Kabbalah and speculative thought and movements of piety.
However, as you said, Zimzum was gaining a measure of credence and attention among the German philosophers at the time, the non-Jewish German philosophers, especially the works of Friedrich Schelling and others. Could you perhaps give us, in a few minutes, an overview? Why is it that, late 18th, early 19th century German philosophy suddenly picked up and ran with this particular Jewish concept?
Well, it's difficult to say. We have after the German Enlightenment, that was kind of dominated by the figure of Kant, who had no idea about Judaism whatsoever. We had in the following generation of philosophers, Hegel, Schelling, Fichte, and then Molitor, we had a bunch of people who are kind of romantics. We have German idealism is parallel to German romanticism, and they had new ideas about mysticism. Mysticism became very important, and they discovered mysticism among the Jews, and that was Kabbalah. They discovered mysticism about the Muslims. We have the first books about the Sufi mystics in German Romanticism, and Christian, the medieval Christian mystics. So for them, mysticism becomes the core of religion, not the proofs of the existence of God and so what we know from the scholasticism. No, in mysticism, the personal experience of God, the presence of God, is the core element of religion. And that's why they are interested in mysticism, in Christianity, of course, Meister Eckhart and Hildegard von Bingen and others, Christian mystics, but also in mysticism in Judaism. And Kabbalah had this idea, and the Zimzum was kind of a quasi-metaphysical teaching that would even explain to those people interested in mysticism, that would even kind of explain how our universe came to be. And you don't need, you have a religious explanation of how, a mystical explanation of how, and this is very, very old. Molitor insists that the teachings of Kabbalah are older than Christianity, and that is interesting. Kabbalah was a Jewish mysticism that prefigured Christianity. And so the oldest teaching of mankind, that was Kabbalah. And that's how they kind of become interested also in this notion of Zimzum, which is part of this turn to mysticism in religion. And it is very interesting that these findings that of this turn from rational religion to mysticism is then taken up by Martin Buber at the beginning of the 20th century, because what he tries in his first writings about the Hasidim is to say those Hasidim that I know from Nachman of Bratslav, they are Jewish mystics. And he compares these Jewish mystics with Sufi, with Rumi, Sufi mystics and with Christian mystics, and that's young Buber. And then he labels Kabbalah mysticism, and then we have among Jews a turn to these ideas that Kabbalah is mysticism, and mysticism is the core of the Jewish religion, and so we have a renaissance of Kabbalah in the 20th century. But in the 19th century, bourgeois Jews didn't want to know about Kabbalah.
This is one of the most fascinating elements of this corner of intellectual history, because at the time, Jewish intellectuals were sort of straining themselves to say, Kabbalah, that's a medieval invention. It's part of the philosophical tradition. And we can sort of, or it's at least parallel to the philosophical tradition. It's a very new invention. Definitely does not go back to the Mishnaic period. Does not go back to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and we can sort of throw it out from our religion. This was the position of many of the Jewish intellectuals in Germany and in Western Europe at the time. Whereas, as you say, a lot of the non-Jewish philosophers, the more and theorists of religion, as you mentioned, from that period, from the Romantic period, from this rebellion against this kind of austere rationality and the Enlightenment, they're the ones going around saying, no, actually, Kabbalah is, it is ancient, it is a primal, it is central to religious experience as such, and it's an extraordinary role reversal, it seems to me.
Yeah, the rediscovery of Kabbalah and also of Lurianic Kabbalah at the beginning of the 20th century is one of the most fascinating parts in Jewish intellectual and religious history. That you have a rediscovery of these not only prior to the rationalist tradition, to the philosophical tradition, but also as deeper. That the personal experience is the core of a religious experience. You may discuss whether this is true, whether this is really the core of the Jewish religion. I mean, Jews are a people, and the revelation goes to the Jewish people, not to Jewish individuals. But it is very interesting to see that at the beginning of the 20th century, in the youth movement and so on, even in the religious Zionist movement, you have a rediscovery of Kabbalah as kind of the core of the Jewish tradition. Not halacha is the core. Not rational the medieval philosophers are not the core. The core of the religious experience of a modern Jew is Kabbalah.
Right, and there is a little bit of irony in that as well, which is that a return to romantic philosophy in both Christian and Jewish circles is also a return to nationalism as well. They went hand in hand. Rejecting the kind of universalism and rationality of the Enlightenment period means going back to the sort of the more spontaneous and more personal forms of religion and religious ideas, and that goes hand in hand with Kabbalah. It's just fascinating, as you say. It seems that the Christians rediscovered this, and the Jews piggyback on them through figures like Buber and also other theorists in the 20th century, Carl Jung and Mircea Eliade, again seeing mysticism as the core experience of religion, something that the 19th century forebears would never have imagined.
Yeah, and what you have, and that is very interesting, is that even in the Zionist movement, which they started out as a secular political movement, and then you have a personality like Rav Kook, and he knows all this Lurianic stuff. You have Rav Ashlag, and they kind of infuse Kabbalah into the Zionist, into the religious Zionist movement. So you have today in Israel, you have living Kabbalah and Kabbalah-inspired communities who kind of have knowledge of this Lurianic trends. You can find reprints of the major Kabbalistic works like Etz Chaim of Chaim Vital in Machane Yehuda and in the bookshops in Jerusalem, in cheap reprints. And that is very interesting, that you have a kind of a renaissance of this Lurianic Kabbalah in the 20th and 21st century.
Yes, it's actually something astonishing because people, especially my age, have grown up with this. They're quite used to it. That Kabbalah is this sort of very popular phenomenon. Lots of people are interested in it. People study the text. People buy books in translation and read it. And it's difficult to describe how half a century ago or more this was so different. This is so very much not the case. That it was this sort of learning was kept to a very small elite. It was very much diminished, and especially in Israel, there wasn't much fertile ground for this kind of spontaneous, popular, mystical kind of religion. Whereas now, it's everywhere. It's seeped in. It seeps all over the Jewish world. I want to ask one final sort of tackle one final theoretical question. There's at the back of your book, you produce a very interesting map, right? This kind of table of all the thinkers and all the and their relationships between them. It looks like a sort of a big family tree of Tzimtzum. It starts with Luria and goes through various figures. Both in the Christian and the Jewish world, and who influenced whom and who got it from whom. But there's one central node to this network in the 21st century, in the 20th century, which is, of course, Gershom Shalom. In other words, within this map. So, the line goes into Gershom Shalom, and from Gershom Shalom, there are arrows everywhere showing how he influenced, and, you have, I don't know, a dozen or more thinkers who got it from Gershom Shalom. So I want to ask about his role in this, because Shalom occupied an unusual role in the history of Jewish ideas in being both a great scholar of Kabbalah, a great investigator, an accountant almost of the Kabbalistic tradition on the one hand, but also a theorist of Judaism, someone who propounded his own ideas on the subject very, very influentially, and sort of had his own system of what Judaism and what rabbinic and Jewish intellectual history was, that went hand in hand with his theories on Kabbalah. So, I guess the question is, what was Shalom's role in the history of Zimzum, both as a scholar but also as a theorist, as someone who had his own ideas on the subject?
I have a chapter on Sholem because in the book, because he has two roles actually. The one role everybody knows, that he is the great scholar of Kabbalah, probably the most important contribution to the history of Judaism in the 20th century. The scholarly contribution of and influence of Sholem is immense. He kind of rediscovered the field of Kabbalah and gives us many categories. However, we may criticize him today, but he has presented Kabbalah and also Lurianic Kabbalah. He has a chapter on Lurianic Kabbalah in his major work. So he kind of makes us know, for example, that Isaac Luria had those 4 disciples who wrote down some pages on the Zimzum. But Sholem, on the other hand, was also fascinated by this idea of Zimzum because he himself, and that you can find in his article on Franz Rosenzweig, he himself thought about Zimzum as being a central figure and the major concept of modern Judaism, namely as an explanation of not how the world came into being, but how we can, in modern times, explain the absence of God. In the modern world, in the 20th century, God is kind of absent from world history. Sholem says he has withdrawn to some non-existence. He does not interfere into our modern life, not in science, not in politics, not in history. What we see in the 20th century is the absence of God from in the sciences, in politics, in history. We have a world that is kind of atheistic, the absence of God, and the notion of and he says and he speculates about a second Zimzum, what he calls it Zimzum Acheron in Hebrew, a last Zimzum that is not the Zimzum of the primal creation, but it's the Zimzum, the withdrawal of God from world history, from his complete absence from what is going on today. So that and this second withdrawal, it's not a withdrawal in order to create the word. It's a withdrawal from our everyday life. And this idea of Scholem would explain that we have kind of this negativity of God, an absence that we have only the traces of God, that he has been there, but we have all these religious traditions that kind of echo God's presence from ancient times until the 20th century. But in the present, we don't have him. He has withdrawn, and Scholem creates, and this is what you call negative theology of God. What we have from God are all these old texts that echo his existence. We have these religious traditions, but we do not have. He has withdrawn from our actual life, and so it's the a theology of the absence of God, and Zimzum kind of enables him to formulate this theology of the absence of God.
Which is extraordinary, of course, because this is a wonderful example of a deeply religious concept, a concept that comes from the soil of a very deeply God infused and God intoxicated worldview, namely that of Isaac Luria, and it, over the generations gets refracted and reflected in various different ways until Gershom Scholem basically comes up with a theory of secularization, I suppose, or disenchantment of the world based on Tzimtzum, or based on the contraction of the divine, and that explains not God's overwhelming presence in everything, but rather God's overwhelming absence in everything. And I suppose after the Holocaust, this is a kind of worldview that would find a sympathetic audience.
Yeah, and we have echoes of that idea in the writings of Hans Jonas when speaking about Zimzum. He says Zimzum explains the absence of God in Auschwitz, and that is kind of a historical interpretation of this of the Zimzum. So when God has withdrawn from history, from our history, the Shoah is possible, and it would explain the absence of God when the Shoah happened. This is what you could call a very skeptical modern Jewish theology. But there are other ways of referring to the Tzimtzum. There are also you still have in Hasidism, you have the positive ideas about the Tzimtzum, and that makes years of dealing with the Tzimtzum so interesting for me, that you have this widespread interpretations and misinterpretations and whatever, we have only interpretations, but you have also very contradictory interpretations of the Tzimtzum, and for some it's a very pious, and for others it's a very pious notion. For others, it's the idea of an explanation for secularism in among modern Jews. So it's there are others who say, oh, it's a good idea to use Tzimtzum in psychotherapy, in business. So you have a widespread number of modern interpretations and adaptations, which are certainly and in many by people who might not have ever read a Hebrew text, who are not scholarly interpreters of Luranic texts, but still these are, I think, chants of a vital Judaism today, and Zimtzum is relevant. I think is a relevant idea to and also a witness of this vibrant life of Judaism today.
This is fascinating. I have to say, if we were to go to all the various applications and ways in which Zimzum has sort of seeped into the popular world, and as you say, in psychology and in business, and you find these books on the shelf everywhere, that will take up another full episode at least. And therefore, I think this would be a good time to draw our discussion to a close. But Professor Christoph Schulte, I'm extremely grateful for you coming on today. This has been a fascinating discussion. And as I said, his book, Zimzum, God and the Origin of the World by Pennsylvania University Press, is now out and highly recommended. We are very grateful for you coming on the podcast of Jewish Ideas, and we look forward and hope to see you at some point again in the future.
Thank you.
This has been the podcast of Jewish Ideas by Torah in Motion, produced by Alicia Kelman and myself, JJ Kimchi. Edited and mixed by Alicia Kelman. You can stay up to date by subscribing in your favorite podcast app. To support more thoughtful Jewish content like this, please visit torahinmotion.org/donate.